history and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live, this is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
You know, we live in a world that is marked by division, by polarism and pluralism, and the need to really begin to reach out and to build bridges rather than barriers. And it's really not enough just to simply tell people about the love of God and the love of Jesus Christ and the kindness of God. We need to demonstrate that as well. So that's why I'm really excited about this book, Loving Samaritans, Radical Kindness in an Us versus Them world. It is published by our good friends at Zondervan, and we'll talk more about it in just a minute. Of course, we have a link to the author, which is Pastor or Dr. Terry Christ. He is the pastor at City of Grace in Phoenix. He has both a THM and a Doctor of Ministry, as well as a business certificate in nonprofit management from Harvard Business School. And Terry, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Well, Kerby, thanks for having me. I want to quickly say that just listening to the list of topics that you cover on a regular basis is slightly intimidating. So I may be qualified to speak to two of those things, but I'll give it my best.
Well, we even last hour were talking with an individual that was talking about pluralism and the need for us to have civility in the midst of religious pluralism. And really, that's kind of the theme that will be going through this hour. You have some great material here, 11 different chapters. We'll get into all of the aspects of that. But I suspect as a pastor, this is not something you've just written about, but you've probably preached about and taught about as well, isn't it?
Fundamentally, I am a pastor. I was raised in a pastor's home, raised in the home of a church planter, and I'm 5 generations deep into pastoral ministry. So that is certainly the lens through which I view life. And ultimately, I want to inspire people to follow Jesus and to love others well. And that's challenging at any point in history, but I think especially in the moment that we find ourselves in. So it is a passion of my heart to equip people and engage people to be kingdom ambassadors right there in their communities.
And so, again, you talk about elevators. First of all, I guess maybe we should define a term, because it's going to be one you and I will use a little bit, missional living. And in your opening section there, you, of course, talk about that. But when we talk about that, let's make sure we're all on the same page in terms of what you mean by that.
Sure. I think living on mission is simply the extension of our spiritual lives, or what some might call their religious life, out beyond the context of our Sunday worship services. So it is a profound movement from Sunday to Monday. It involves us engaging the community around us for the sake of common good, and clearly doing our very best in a way that is civil and kind and gracious and compassionate, to bear witness to the gospel and to represent Jesus. So by missional living, I'm simply talking about living your life for the sake of the kingdom of God. Oftentimes when we think about missionaries, we tend to think of people who live elsewhere on the planet. But I think to some degree, we should all see ourselves to that same mindset, whether we are reaching across geographical lines or demographic lines or psychographic lines. We are situated in our communities as these ambassadors of the kingdom of God, as representatives of Jesus. And missional living means that I see myself, whether that I am in vocational ministry or working in a school or in a corporation or at a food service counter, wherever I do life Monday through Friday, I see that as my personal mission field.
Sure. Well, and one of the mission fields is in an elevator. I always love to see how people react in elevators because one of the elevators that go up and down is a place where a lot of Christian ministries are, and I usually engage in a conversation. But in this elevator, when we get to this radio studio, which is a little different, everybody wants to look at their phones and not talk to anybody. But you have had a situation in which you've decided to actually move from a suburban neighborhood and to actually go to a high-rise. And in some respects, ministry can happen right there in the elevator, can't it?
It certainly can and does. My wife and I have been married for 40 years, Kerby, and like so many young couples, we started off in a little apartment, and then as our family grew, we expanded, and before long, we found ourselves living in the suburbs. And through the course of planting and pastoring churches in 3 different cities, we have spent the majority of our lives either in small towns or in the suburbs. And about 4 years ago, we felt a call to move into the heart of the city, into the upper urban core right here in Phoenix, Arizona, and to engage personally in ministering to our neighbors. We've been privileged to pastor a large church that God has graciously blessed and has expanded over the course of 24 years now. And as is often the case when a church begins to expand, and staff comes on board to help with the load, the pastor transitions from being exactly that to more of a CEO. And I think that it's easy to outsource your compassion. It's easy to give assignments. It's easy to write checks. It's easy to do a lot of things, and sometimes not as easy to say, I want to roll up my shirt sleeves and I want to engage with my community at a basic level. So we moved into the city, moved into a high-rise building. We live on the 14th floor, and we ride the elevator multiple times a day. Mm-hmm. And our neighborhood and community is radically diverse, and it has made for some very interesting conversations.
I would encourage people to read the book, especially because you have some of those. But just before we take a break, let's talk about this concept of ministry of presence, because you talk about the fact that some researchers have talked about technoference, and whether it's on an elevator, and I look and almost everybody wants to look at their phone, and I intentionally don't because I'd like to at least try to make eye contact, or whether you go into a restaurant and you see 4 people sitting across the table and all of them are looking at their phones rather than to each other, or even possibly around the dinner table, the same thing is taking place. And if we're going to be actually learning to be loving Samaritans, we need a ministry of presence, don't we?
We certainly do. We live at a very remarkable and unusual moment in history when we are more connected than we've ever been. And yet, as you pointed out, we're probably more disconnected than we've ever been. And I think in this world, our witness may be one of our greatest witnesses. The fact that we see people as individuals, the fact that we connect with them personally. We don't just walk through our day seeing a sea of faces, but we, based on the model that Jesus gives us throughout the Gospels, we see people as individuals, image bearers, people in need of the gospel, in need of kindness and compassion and consideration. And I think once we begin to see people that way, it really does open up the opportunity to share the love of Jesus with them.
Let's take a break, and when we come back, we're going to dig into this a little bit more. First, maybe the differences between Pharisees and Samaritans, both biblically, and I think you'll be surprised, probably not, that we see some of them today as well. And this is all part of a book that has come out in January called Loving Samaritans, Radical Kindness in an Us versus Them World. We're privileged to have with us Pastor Terry Christ, and you will find some great information about him. You will also find information about the book on the website. Since it's been out for a while, I suspect you'll be able to find it in your local bookstore, but if you cannot, we have information about it so that you can get it either in paperback or Kindle. We'll take a break and continue right after these important messages.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
On my radio program the other day, I provided a good news, bad news news story. The good news is the youngest generations, that would be millennials and Gen Z, are reading the Bible. The bad news is they don't always believe what they are reading is accurate. The statistics come from the State of the Church Initiative and were recently reported by Leonardo Blair in the Christian Post. Interviews with over 12,000 were conducted online. They discovered that approximately 50% of self-identified Christians report reading the Bible weekly. This is the highest level of Bible reading among Christians in more than a decade. Dave Kinnaman is the CEO of Barna Group and has observed that people aren't just curious about faith, they're opening Scripture for themselves. This trend aligns with other signs of renewal, which we've seen in our research, like growing commitments to Jesus and increased church attendance. Women traditionally have been more likely to read the Bible weekly, but the latest data shows that more younger men are reading the Bible than younger women. It's also worth mentioning that nearly 40% of young adult Gen Z women now identify as religiously unaffiliated. While we can applaud the fact that so many are reading the Bible, we must also deal with the fact that fewer maintain that the Bible is 100% accurate. 25 years ago, 43% of Americans thought the Bible was completely accurate. Today, that percentage has slipped to 36%. Even among self-identified Christians, less than half strongly affirm the accuracy of the Bible. This disconnect illustrates why we not only need to teach the Bible, but we need to teach Christians why it is true by pointing to an abundance of evidence that confirms the Bible. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Socialism, go to viewpoints.info/socialism. That's viewpoints.info/socialism. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Privileged to have with us today Pastor Terry Christ as we talk about Loving Samaritans, Radical Kindness in an Us versus Them World. It is published by Zondervan, and he is with us to talk about some of the issues. And I thought, Terry, for just a minute, maybe the distinction between a Pharisee and a Samaritan. I suspect some of our listeners will know that. But first of all, what do we find in the Bible, and do we not see some of those same individuals in the world today?
Well, they certainly exist today. Both do. I think that the reason I paired the Pharisees and the Samaritans together in the book in the way that I have is because they share a common origin story, and yet, on the other hand, they represent people on the opposite side of a cultural divide. When you read through the Gospel of John, you find the bookends of the Pharisees and the Samaritans in John chapter 3 and John chapter 4. In John chapter 3, we see Jesus interacting with Nicodemus, who is a Pharisee. And there, of course, is the beautiful and powerful encounter that he has with him and the conversation about what it means to be born again, what it means to enter into the kingdom of God. From there, Jesus then leaves, and the Bible gives us the picture that he fled that environment. He fled Judea because that there was a controversy ensuing between his disciples and the disciples of John over who had baptized the most. So I guess the more things change, the more they stay the same.
Yes.
And Jesus wanted nothing to do with that controversy. He wasn't into counting nickels and noses. He was on mission. And so he leaves Judea, and on his way back to the Galilee, he had to go through Samaria. We find Jesus at Jacob's well before long, and there he has a conversation with the Samaritan woman, which is the longest recorded conversation in the Gospels. And it embodies the most provocative issues of the times. In this conversation, we could say it encompasses cultural identities and religion and even politics and power dynamics and sexuality. And Jesus is able to have this honest and truthful conversation with her in such a way that it doesn't rebuff her, but instead it attracts her to the kindness and compassion of God. That leads then to her salvation and the salvation of many in her village. From there, Jesus then goes into the little community, Sy Garte, and spends 2 days there. So the interesting movement in the Gospel of John is that Jesus comes from this conversation with Nicodemus, this presumably influential, possibly affluent religious leader, to now the longest conversation recorded, which in and of itself says something, to 2 days that are missing in his itinerary. And from that point onward, we see Jesus in this love affair, if you will, with the Samaritans. He reaches out to them. He ministers to them. On one occasion, a Samaritan village rejects him, and the disciples want to call down fire on it. And Jesus says, no,
Yes.
as if you could anyway, right? And then finally, right before he ascends into heaven, in his final instructions, he says to the disciples, I want you to go to Jerusalem and Judea. And by the way, don't forget, my friends, the Samaritans.
Yes.
So this conversation is a beautiful picture of cultural engagement. He shows us radical kindness, gracious civility, and he shows us how to deal with the other in the world. And we're surrounded by a world of others. Who are they? And what can we do to reach them with the kindness of God?
Again, you have a whole chapter on insiders and outsiders, seeing self and serving others. But when we stay on the idea of Samaritans, first of all, we have a positive image today. When somebody's called a good Samaritan, we think he's do a good job. But you can imagine the reaction to a Samaritan does this. And you actually talk about the fact that in some respects that was behind enemy lines, because so often people in that day would go out of their way. And I've taken a number of tours to Israel, and I try to show them sometimes we're on the bus. Now there's Samaria. You can imagine how they'd have to sort of walk out of their way not to go through Samaria. And instead here, he actually takes these disciples, maybe somewhat unwillingly, into Samaritan territory. And in some respects, that helps us understand that that is exactly what we're being called to do today, don't you think?
No righteous Jew would be willingly caught dead or alive with the Samaritan. There was a long and storied and painful history there, and it goes back to the 8th century when the Assyrians invaded the land and deported about 20,000 inhabitants of the land and repopulated the land with 5 different nations. So the Samaritans come out of this common origin story, but they become this mixed race. And over time, they drift from worshiping the one true and living God, and they begin to embrace this syncretistic blend where they adhere to some of the Torah, but not all of it. So by the time Jesus comes along and begins his earthly ministry, we see this history. But it's not just a painful history with the Samaritans. The well that he chooses to meet the woman at also has a long and painful history.
Yes.
And it's a storied history. It was a place of blessing and a place of pain. And I think both the Samaritans and Jacob's well represent the culture that we find ourselves in today. We live in a world that is syncretistic, pluralistic, blended. People have sort of self-styled and freestyled their faith, and they have a little bit drawn from Christianity and a little bit from Buddhism and a little bit from secularism. And like the Samaritans, they just created their own system of belief and their own worldview. And that's situated at a place of pain and brokenness in our culture as well. So I think the parallels between Jesus and the Samaritans and the church and the culture are undeniable. And God puts this in the text to teach us something really powerful about connecting with people unlike us.
Well, let's see if we can connect that to what's going on right now, because we have tribes, we have tribalism, we have the other. You tell the story about you and your wife going to an African village, and your wife looks a little different than you, just as my wife does, and I can relate to that because they probably wanted to, as you say, touch her hair. They've never seen hair like that, skin, things like that. So it was very obvious who the other was. That was you. But as you point out, it gets kind of murky, maybe even a little bit foggy when the someone other is your own family, maybe a person in a different church, different community, or maybe even a person that is very pagan and maybe very hostile to you. And so in some respects, we have to once again take some of those lessons that we learned from Jesus, don't we?
We do. We do. We live in a world that is highly tribal. And I don't know, Kerby, that there's anything wrong with existing in tribes. People associate with tribes for a wide range of benefits, and even ancient Israel was tribal, a nation of tribes. Jesus was born into a tribe. So we're all a part of tribes, whether our tribe is our alma mater, our tribe is our football club, or whatever the case may be, our associations. The problem, however, is with tribalism. And the ism part of that is when we begin to see people in other tribes, not just as distinct, not just as unique, not just as holding differing beliefs, but we feel as if that their existence becomes a threat to ours. So we then engage either directly or indirectly, consciously and subconsciously, in trying to eradicate them. And this is the danger that we see in the world around us today. It's not that we're just all existing here and interacting at the fringes and the overlap to the best of our ability. It's that we are divided politically, we're divided racially and ethnically, we're divided religiously, and we're uncomfortable with those divisions because we feel that everyone has to conform to our belief system. So the real challenge in this world is not that we are unique. We've been unique. It's that in our day, we feel the need to make everyone conform.
Yes. Let's take a break, and when we come back, we'll continue our conversation with Pastor Terry Crisp, and the book is entitled Loving Samaritans, Radical Kindness in an Us versus Them World. We'll talk about the separation of church and hate, truth and tone, the idea of compassionate conversations, as well as, well, let's face the obvious, politics, pandemics, polarization. We are dealing with a lot, and we talk about this so often here on Point of View, and I think this book would be a great addition to your library and a resource that you could use. For those of you that are pastors, you may want to preach out of this particular book. For those of you that have a life group or a small group, you might want to use this as a teaching series, and we have information not only about Terry and his church, but also about the book. No doubt you probably can find it in your local bookstore, but you have any difficulty at all, we have information about it. You can get it either in paperback or Kindle. We have a lot more to cover, and we'll do our best to do so right after these important messages.
I have a little nutcracker decoration that counts down the days, and it tells me that Thanksgiving and Christmas are coming fast. But you know, so is another special day, Giving Tuesday, December 2nd. People around the world are going to take part in this annual tradition of showing generosity in the middle of a season that's often marked by busyness and consumerism. It is so easy to focus on what we need in our own life, but I encourage you, pray about what you can give this Giving Tuesday, and consider partnering with Point of View. By partnering with Point of View this Giving Tuesday, you'll be part of a mission to give truth to America in a time when it's desperately needed. Mark your calendar so you don't forget to give on Giving Tuesday, December 2nd. Or you can give anytime by visiting us online at pointofview.net or calling 1-800-347-5151, pointofview.net, and 1-800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Continue our conversation today as we talk about the book Loving Samaritans. How can we bring grace and harmony and empathy and love and acceptance into our world that is so polarized? I think you will certainly appreciate this book. It is published by Zondervan. It is written by Pastor Terry Crisp. And again, I wanted to get to one of the chapters on the separation of church and hate. First of all, I don't need to remind you about the fact that the church has sometimes not done so well. There have been scandals. There have been issues of all sorts that are the case. Sometimes we aren't doing a good job of preparing people to be good Samaritans in the world. But Terry, I thought, if nothing else, maybe telling the backstory of Shechem is just, again, a biblical principle that we can begin to apply to our world today.
So the backstory of Shechem is a little complicated. It has some very redemptive moments, and then it has some painful moments, much like each of our lives, I guess. This happened to be the place when Abraham leaves his father's household. There he encounters God near the oak of Mamre, and this becomes a sacred spot, if you will. So it is the site of God having moved in a way that established his promise, but it also then turns and becomes this dark site. Later on, we see Jacob settling there after he's reunited with his brother Esau, and that becomes a place where his daughter Dinah is raped. The painful story that continues from there is that her brothers avenged her dishonor and killed the men of the village. So when Jesus chooses to have this conversation there, he's not having it in a vacuum, so to speak. And I think what he is really showing us is the fact that even though each of our communities has these painful places, along with some redemptive places, we need to be reminded of the fact that all people are worthy of respect. All people are worthy of being heard. All people are worthy of hearing the truth without insult, and all people are worthy of unconditional love. What I'm calling people to do, Kerby, is to just be mindful of what it means to see the people around us as image bearers. I know as people of faith, we have deep-seated convictions, and in the moment that we find ourselves in, it's easy to feel that our faith is under attack, and there are some evidences to bear witness to that. But we can either live life on the offensive or the defensive. And I don't see Jesus living from a defensive posture. I see him going into enemy territory. I see him in conversations with the religious and the irreligious. And I see him consistently having those conversations in a way that is kind and compassionate and gracious without compromising truth. And I think it's important to say that. I'm certainly not advocating for any reworking of the fundamentals of the truth. We believe that the gospel is good news, and it is timeless and timely. I think, however, many people reject the gospel, not because of the content of the gospel, but oftentimes because the tone in which we share the gospel. We share Christ out of contention. We share the good news with an angry spirit. We share the love of Jesus in a way that seems to be seeking to win arguments instead of winning people. And so I'm inviting people to take a moment, take a deep breath, and look around you and realize that you're in a community filled with people that Jesus loves and shed his blood for. And he wants to use you in a way that connects them to the living water of salvation that brings them into a personal relationship with him.
And again, you talk about this idea of truth and tone in one of the chapters, an art of compassionate conversation. We've actually had some conversations in the past about the ministry of listening and just the need right now by the fact that we're just surrounded by this cacophony of voices and sounds and comments and the rest. And it does seem to me that if we do not join in with that, but we figure out ways to actually speak the truth in love and to be gracious, I think that's going to be attractive to individuals who are maybe palmated so many different times and attacked so many different times and maybe ridiculed and even labeled to actually be drawn to the fact that it isn't just truth, but it's love that's tied with truth, and that is needed ever more than ever before simply because of the world that we find ourselves in with. There is so much increased division in this world.
I like to think of the idea of grace and truth as a tightly stretched rubber band. The tension is unbearable, and we want to let up on one end or the other. We want to give on the truth side, or we want to give on the grace side. But I think we have to hold that tension. I don't think we can prioritize the things that the Bible holds in tension. So we've got to hold that tension, and what makes that possible is love. It's just simply loving people the way that Jesus loved people. I do think that the conversations that we have are important and I encourage people to have courageous but not contentious conversations, to be able to speak the truth in love. But fundamentally, ours is a show and tell gospel, and the telling part isn't heard when the showing part is absent. So we have to find that way to connect with people at their point of need, at their pain point. I think if people walk through their community with their eyes wide open, they'll find that the traces of grace are already present in your neighborhood, in your apartment building, in your on the job that you work on. God is already there working in the lives of people, even though they may not be aware of that. And if you can identify the way that God is at work, then you can connect with that and amplify that and help people to see that. It's the old Blackaby line. Find out what God is doing and join him in it. We don't take Jesus anywhere. He's already there. And we have to find out how he is working in the lives of people and help them to see that so they surrender to his grace and to salvation.
Let's give some practical suggestions. Of course, we've talked about listening, and Jesus, as you said, was a master listener. But I appreciate something that you shared about your own experience, because I've had the same. My parents, you say, instilled in me the value of answering questions directly, a lesson that was further reinforced through a lifetime of education in the Western world. Okay, that all being said, and I learned the same thing, that you can answer and should answer the question. Don't be evasive like a lot of politicians and the rest. But you also remind us, as we have talked about on this program, that there are a lot of questions that Jesus asked. Most people say 113, at least in your book you say that, and he really only answered 3 of those. So in some respects, there are questions that were asked of him. In most cases, he asked questions, and I found that sometimes asking questions is a very good way to get people to, first of all, share what they're thinking, to understand where they're coming from, and then in some cases, as we maybe go down that trail of asking questions, to see some of the logical inconsistencies of their views. So not only should we be a good listener, it seems to me in lots of cases we should be a good question asker as well.
I think you're right. And I think the amazing thing about Jesus is that he didn't allow the conversation to be co-opted. He didn't allow it to be controlled, even though he only answers a few questions, whether we're getting the numbers right from the way that we read the scripture and the version that we're reading it in or not, whether it's 112 or 13 questions that are asked of him. We do know that he only answers a few of them directly, but he makes people feel seen. He makes people feel heard. He makes people feel his presence. And I think that comes out of the state of his interior life. And of course, we know he was fully man and fully God. But I think that listening is a profound act of love that relates to the state of our interior lives, when our hearts are at peace, when we are a non-anxious presence, when we are gentle of spirit and empathic and compassionate and kind and peaceful. then those things translate, I think, into a natural curiosity that people connect with. I encourage people practically to just get out in the community and do some really deep listening. I tell pastors pretty frequently, get off the campus, bro. I love what God's doing on our church campuses, and I'm a church kid. I'm a rapidly aging church kid, but I love the church, and I love what God is doing. But I think what we need to do in order to connect with the new generation and with a world that doesn't see the value of the church as many of us see and know, we need to get into our coffee shops. And I'm not talking about going into a coffee shop with the big family Bible and with your laptop to prepare your sermon while trying to imagine the questions around you.
We're going to take a break. We have a lot more to cover. It's all part of Loving Samaritans. Pastor Terry Christ will be back right after this.
This is the second story I have been pleased to tell in recent weeks in which a school district backed down from violating the First Amendment religious freedom of students and parents. In this case, First Liberty Institute had to sue California's Encinitas Union School District in federal court. Perhaps school officials in this beach community didn't understand or simply chose to ignore the United States Supreme Court's June 2024 ruling in Mahmoud v. Taylor. First Liberty's CEO, Kelly Shackelford, explains that according to that decision, parents cannot be denied the right to receive notice and opt out from any teaching that substantially interferes with their religious beliefs. The ruling gives clear guidance for what happened in Encinitas. Kayla Toney, counsel for First Liberty, says, "We represent two Christian families whose fifth graders were forced to teach their kindergarten buddies about gender ideology using a book called My Shadow is Pink." The story's main character is a boy who sees his shadow as pink. According to the book, the pink shadow reveals your innermost you. So the boy wears a dress to school. His father decides this is okay and puts a dress on too. A teacher at La Costa Heights Elementary read the book aloud to fifth graders. As part of the school's mentoring program, fifth grade students were assigned to watch a video of the reading with their kindergarten buddy. Then, the fifth graders were supposed to ask their kindergartner what color shadow represents them and to draw the shadow with chalk. Parents of some fifth graders had a problem with their 10 and 11-year-olds being required to tell little kids to question their own gender identity. The parents asked to be notified of future similar teaching and given the right to opt out. A district court ruled for the parents. The next step was the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, but the district voluntarily withdrew their appeal. It looks like they saw the writing on the wall. For Point of View, I'm Penna Dexter.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Loving Samaritans, Radical Kindness, and an Us versus Them World. It is published by Zondervan, written by Pastor Terry Christ. And Terry, let's, if we can, get back to the woman at the well, the Samaritan woman, because that helps us think about how to navigate guilt and shame and acceptance, because we are dealing with a lot of individuals who either feel criticized, or have been criticized, or in one way or or another do not have an interest in the gospel, interest in the church because of experiences that they have actually had. And so it seems to me that once again, we can learn some vicarious lessons for how Jesus actually addressed that woman.
I think one of the things we can learn there is the importance of, again, seeing people uniquely and individually. We often make assumptions about people without having conversations with them about who they are and why they do what they do. And I think it's just so easy to see people in a way that's collective and maybe even nationalistic, or we see them as a monolith instead of seeing them personally and individually. And when we do that, when we make decisions about who they are without having conversations with them, we then tend to label them. And I think a lot of believers need to interrogate the stereotypes that we hold about people. We often say all people, all blank people are blank. So we fill in those blanks with what we perceive about groups of people. But I've discovered, Kerby, that you can have people that are engaged in what we would consider sinful behavior. And not everyone engaged in the same behavior is engaged in it for the same reason. And sometimes it's hard to really help people and to lead them into a life of freedom when we are antagonistic toward them. We've already defined them and we've labeled them. And of course, when we label people, we often negate them. So I think the beauty of what I see in this story is that Jesus didn't label the woman in Samaria. He didn't label her. He had, a really courageous conversation with her that wasn't contagious, or contentious rather, but he allows her to respond, to engage with him. And in doing that, he leads her to a place where she's open to the gospel.
Let's, we can talk about the culture that we find ourselves in. You have a chapter on politics, pandemics, and polarization. And you, a decade ago, actually spoke to an issue of cultural crash. But as you mentioned, being a fifth-generation pastor, you said, I'm pretty sure my grandfather would be shocked to hear the topics we're discussing, many of which, of course, we mentioned just as we started the program here today, and many of which we talk about and write about here at Point of View. But it does seem to me that we need to understand that we are in a situation in which the culture has been coming against the church, and there is a reality that both Jesus and the Samaritan woman lived in a highly polarized society. So in some respects, this isn't new. So what can we learn from that conversation and learn from Jesus about how to address some of these hot-button cultural topics here in the 21st century?
I think you're absolutely right. Listening to the earlier segment before I came on, I heard you indicate something to the effect of we don't have the home field advantage any longer. So that's true. Things have certainly shifted and changed. And at the same time, we can either look at this through the lens of feeling that the challenge is insurmountable, or we can look at it through the lens of seeing that this generation is ripe for the gospel. Kerby, I go back and forth between thinking that we're living in the most divided times ever and then probably not. So when I'm feeling the intensity of the conversations around me, when I'm looking at the news feed, it feels very, very divided and polarized. When I then go back to history and I look at the world that Jesus was born into, look at the divisions that existed, not just between Jews and Samaritans and Pharisees, but he's living in a culture that's being occupied. Religious immorality is rampant. Corinth had something like 1,000 prostitutes in 12 different temples. Then I see that the culture that we find ourselves in is probably not the most divided and sinful culture in the history of the world. So in seeing it that way, there's hope. There's hope to really engage with people for the sake of the gospel. We don't have to cede the moment that we're in, but we do have to begin to realize that this moment is not going to be redeemed by anything less than individual conversations with people and personal salvation. We have to get back into community and connecting with people so that their lives can be transformed by the gospel. The gospel is sufficient. The grace of God is effective, and people, I believe, can be changed, and many will be changed if we become faithful to engage with them. Not hiding in the holy huddle, not just, angry because that the culture has shifted, but we really get back to the way of Jesus, to the practices of Jesus. It has always been effective and always will be.
Well, again, you even talk about the fact that some of that division's inside the church. I love that. The tale of two mountains, Mount Gerizim and Mount Zion, but you could also, of course, talk about Mount Gerizim and Mount Ebal and others. And so sometimes it's not just the division outside the church, it's the division inside the church. But I thought just before we run out of time, Terry, I really wanted to have you speak for a minute about, number one, how individuals could benefit from this book. I think anybody can read through this book and benefit, but I also, as a pastor, might want for a minute for you to talk to other pastors, Bible study teachers, life group leaders, and others, because it seems to me that you could actually go through a chapter a week and teach that. There's a place where you can actually get more information about that. We have a book sample. You have discussion guides. You have conversation cards and much more at terrychrist.com, which is on the website along with the book. But can you, for just a minute or two, give us an overview on how people might be able to apply this inside their own church?
Absolutely. And let me say thank you for that. It is very kind of you to make that available. I think there are a couple of things. First of all, in engaging in the book, my hope is to bring people back to the gospel. I don't think that we need to improve upon the way of Jesus. I think we need to return to the way of Jesus. Love has always been the original apologetic. And yes, our gospel is a show and tell gospel, so the telling part is very, very important. But we really need to get back to the showing part. And the book really, I think, goes a long way to help people embrace a Jesus way of being. There are a lot of practical ideas throughout the book and how to connect with your neighbors and the people in your company and coffee shops and across your service counter. But fundamentally, it's about us returning to a sense of being that is faithful to the gospel. So I would encourage people to pick up a copy of Loving Samaritans. It's a labor of love. I've lived it out in the streets of our city for 24 years. And it really does work. We don't need to improve on the way of Jesus. We need to return to the way of Jesus. And in doing so, I believe that our best days are ahead for the church.
Well, again, Terry Crisp, it has been great to have you on the program. Thank you for writing the book, and thank you for giving us an hour today here on Point of View.
Thanks, brother.
But just before we go, let me again mention that it is entitled Loving Samaritans, Radical Kindness in an Us versus Them World. It really explores a lot of themes, grace and unity and empathy and love and acceptance. It is, of course, tied into the story, of course, of the Samaritan woman, but also just learning some very important principles that we find in the gospel and apply it to our 21st century world. So again, if you'd like to know more about Terry or about the book, go to our website at pointofview.net. And you've been listening to Point of View.
In 19th century London, two towering historical figures did battle, not with guns and bombs, but words and ideas. London was home to Karl Marx, the father of communism, and legendary Baptist preacher Charles Spurgeon. London was in many ways the center of the world, economically, militarily, and intellectually. Marx sought to destroy religion, the family, and everything the Bible supports. Spurgeon stood against him, warning of socialism's dangers. Spurgeon understood Christianity is not just religious truth, it is truth for all of life. Where do you find men with that kind of wisdom to stand against darkness today? Get the light you need on today's most pressing issues delivered to your inbox when you sign up for the Viewpoints commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Every weekday in less than 2 minutes, you'll learn how to be a person of light to stand against darkness in our time. It's free, so visit pointofview.net/signup right now. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
I just wanted to tell you, too, how much I have appreciated Point of View over the years. I've always been taught that we take care of our own, and I feel like Point of View is one of our own because of the Christian worldview that you do promote. And so I have become a partner today, and I just want to thank you so much, and just God bless you for all that you do.
Listen, I wanted to make a quick comment. I'm a relatively new listener to the show, and I really kind of stumbled upon it more than anything because I'm doing some driving now that I wasn't in the past. And my comment really is, I think you guys and gals are more right on about the assessment of this country right now than anything I've heard. You know, I go home and I tell my wife, you've got to hear what they're talking about on the show. It's just so right on. And I tell my parents the same thing.
I'm 25 years old, and I started listening to Point of View about 4 years ago, and it has changed the way that I think and the way that I view the world around me.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
This hour we're going to talk about a journey of healing and forgiveness. I'll admit that this book, especially in about the first 200 pages, is tough reading because of some of the abuse and some of the difficulties. But again, if you have ever seen Carrie Sheffield on television or in other forms of media, you will say, I would never have guessed. And she is an individual that has been a columnist and broadcaster. She won a Robert Novak Journalism Fellowship Award, an individual that we have seen in various venues. She actually wrote editorials for the Washington Times under Tony Blankley. She's been on, of course, Fox News and Fox Business, MSNBC, Good Morning America, on the list and goes on. Pictures of her on HBO's Real Time with Bill Maher. An individual with a bachelor's degree from Brigham Young University and a master's degree from Harvard University. But the story is actually of a young girl, fifth of 8 children, with a violent, mentally ill street musician father. Believed he was kind of a modern-day Mormon prophet. We are going to be talking about abuse. We're talking about going to so many different public schools, traveling out on a motorhome, and all sorts of other issues, and eventually having her father excommunicated from the LDS Church. Her own spiritual pilgrimage, becoming a Christian in large part from some of the people we interview and have known here on Point of View. So this book has only been out a couple of days. You should be able to find it in your local bookstore, but we have a link to her website and the book, Motorhome Prophecies, A Journey of Healing and Forgiveness. Carrie, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Hey there. Thank you for having me. It's good to be here, Kerby.
Let's, if we can, start off with Grandpa Ralph and your father, Ralph, because the family story is incredible. Kind of difficult to read, but of course you had to live it, so that's even more of a significant issue. And you do kind of bring us through this whole issue of what it was like to live in that household. Can you kind of give us a background?
Yeah, I've certainly had people tell me that the book is traumatic to read, and I say, well, imagine if reading it how it was to live it. And the background is that my grandfather was a very successful real estate developer, and he was the former Republican whip in the Utah legislature. My aunt, so that would be my grandpa's daughter, my dad's sister, she was Miss United States of America, Miss USA. She was the former Miss Utah USA. So we came from a pretty well-known, prominent family in Utah. But I call our story, it's more of like a riches to rags story, actually. And I think it's kind of a squandering of inheritance that, unfortunately, partially due to sexual abuse that my dad suffered when he was a toddler by a Mormon babysitter who was trusted by their family. My father said that later on caused him to feel suicidal ideation. And he had some other childhood traumas that he passed on in different ways to us as children, to the point where, like you mentioned, so I have 7 biological siblings. And so my dad and mom, all 10 of us, grew up in large parts during our upbringing, living in a motorhome with 10 people. And the physics of that is very uncomfortable, not very great from a sewage standpoint. But, and I say repeatedly in the book, it's not about being poor. In fact, some of the most poor people in the world are the happiest. It's really about how you're treated. And unfortunately, we did not have healthy treatment in the home consistently, and we had a lot of abuse spiritually, physically, emotionally, and spiritually. And the end result was that 2 of my brothers developed schizophrenia, and 3 of my siblings have attempted suicide, and I suffered with suicidal ideation and PTSD and depression on and off for a long time. And it was really, and I think what made it so upsetting, and I think for your audience would be interested, was that it was all done in the name of God. That
Yes.
My dad said it was will that we were abused. And so it took a long time for me to disaggregate, okay, what is God's will? Is there a God? Is there a God that loves me, or is there a God that's hostile to me, or is it different to me?
Well, and again, that's one of the reasons I'm holding up right now. One of the booklets we've been making available recently is on abusive churches and on spiritual abuse, because that abuse sometimes takes place with the kind of the divine sanction created by that abuser, and that is certainly one of those issues. And as you said, you have no desire or intent to destroy religion. Matter of fact, later on, of course, we'll talk about your conversion. But you also, with 4 older brothers, you the oldest girl, I guess you were the first to escape the motorhome. But can you, for just a minute, maybe give us a little bit of an idea of what that was like? Because you were always on the move. Your father figured out ways to escape paying his taxes, and actually was involved in so many things that eventually the Mormon Church excommunicated him because of these, or if you will, sort of relevant prophecies. They were always very appropriate at the time to actually be able to manipulate individuals, including, of course, your family.
Right. Well, and it was a lot of coercion. I mean, my dad's, he's 86. He'll be 86 in a few weeks. He's very charismatic. And, at his peak, he was 6'2", blonde hair, blue eyes. His sister was Miss USA, so he was very attractive, good genes. And I think that can happen a lot when you're talking about, charismatic. I mean, his father was a politician. Being able to put on a good front to begin with, but behind that facade, hiding a lot that's really not healthy. And so, we lived in houses also, and that was by the end, I attended 17 public schools and homeschools. Mm-hmm. So it wasn't just motorhomes. We had houses sometimes, but we also lived in tents. My mom gave birth when our family lived in a tent.
Yes, I saw
we
it.
lived in.
Yeah.
And so it was really unstable. But my dad said that he was called by God to save America from destruction, and that he would become president someday. And he said that it was God's will for us to play music on street corners and pass out religious pamphlets to try to convert people to be Mormon. And so it was, like I said, I think I try to be as compassionate to him in the book as I can to understand the roots of his childhood trauma and his response to that. And I think that generationally, the Bible talks about the sins being placed upon the children from the fathers.
Right.
That it can be intergenerational curses, but it also, on the flip side, in other places, talks about the hearts of the children turning to the fathers and that reconciliation. And so I think I wrestled with that toward the end of the book. I quoted Billy Graham, where he talks about the difference between honoring your parents and obeying your parents. And he says that, the Bible says to honor your father and mother.
Yes.
Well, he doesn't say you have to necessarily obey them if they're asking to do something that's not in alignment with God's will. And so when I was going through a lot of anger toward my dad, I was dishonoring him with my words and my heart, and God had to help me understand that difference between obedience and honoring.
We'll take a break, continue our conversation right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
On my radio program the other day, I provided a good news, bad news news story. The good news is the youngest generations, that would be millennials and Gen Z, are reading the Bible. The bad news is they don't always believe what they are reading is accurate. The statistics come from the State of the Church Initiative and were recently reported by Leonardo Blair in the Christian Post. Interviews with over 12,000 were conducted online. They discovered that approximately 50% of self-identified Christians report reading the Bible weekly. This is the highest level of Bible reading among Christians in more than a decade. Dave Kinnaman is the CEO of Barna Group and has observed that people aren't just curious about faith, they're opening Scripture for themselves. This trend aligns with other signs of renewal, which we've seen in our research, like growing commitments to Jesus and increased church attendance. Women traditionally have been more likely to read the Bible weekly, but the latest data shows that more younger men are reading the Bible than younger women. It's also worth mentioning that nearly 40% of young adult Gen Z women now identify as religiously unaffiliated. While we can applaud the fact that so many are reading the Bible, we must also deal with the fact that fewer maintain that the Bible is 100% accurate. 25 years ago, 43% of Americans thought the Bible was completely accurate. Today, that percentage has slipped to 36%. Even among self-identified Christians, less than half strongly affirm the accuracy of the Bible. This disconnect illustrates why we not only need to teach the Bible, but we need to teach Christians why it is true by pointing to an abundance of evidence that confirms the Bible. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Socialism, go to viewpoints.info/socialism. That's viewpoints.info/socialism. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Continue our conversation today with Carrie Sheffield. Motorhome Prophecies, A Journey of Healing and Forgiveness. The book has just come out. You should be able to find it in your local bookstore. About 300 pages. Incredible story. And Carrie, just maybe to illustrate the point, let's talk about whenever you needed medical or dental help. Playing soccer, crack open your head. Your father, Ralph, announces that if you go to the emergency room, no Christmas presents, so you have to endure getting stitched up in the most gross way you can imagine. You had a tooth that started moving out. I think you said at one point 90 degrees. Hard to believe now I've seen your picture. And instead using if you will, a popsicle stick to push it back in. That was kind of what was happening in that family. And it just illustrates again what you had to endure even as a young child.
Right, exactly. And that time when he stitched up the back of my head, it was around Christmas time, and I had been playing soccer in the basement because we had a house at that point, which we didn't live in for very much longer after that. But and then I hit the back of the head, and it was okay. Do you want? Because we didn't have health insurance, and so he said, would you like your siblings to not get Christmas presents, or by going to the ER and having to pay for it, or I just do it myself here with your mom's needle and thread. And so I said, well, that's kind of having my 7 siblings hate me for forever for stealing Christmas and being the Grinch. That's an easy choice. So I let him do that. And I still have the scar on the back of my head, but thankfully it ended up being a success because it wasn't, thankfully that deep. But it certainly was painful. And and again, I'm not here to knock poverty in terms of like having any disrespect for people who are poor, or I just did a mission trip last year with my church down to Lima, Peru, and we visited some of the poorest neighborhoods in Catabayo, up in the mountains. And we walked into one of the homes, and I was just transported back to the shed when I was 17 in the Ozarks in Missouri. Yes. And the smell and the dankness and the lack of plumbing properly. And it was like a time machine. It was actually, I felt actually very connected with the people of Peru, having gone through those similar struggles, living in some ways a first world childhood a third world childhood in a first world country as an American.
Right.
And again, it's not about poverty, although that was part of the story, but it was a self-selected poverty, that it was something that my dad chose, right, because he thought that was God's will. And what I find interesting is that as I was going out of my, I call it my walk in darkness, my about 12 years as an agnostic, this idea of prosperity gospel in Protestantism, that I think that's in the opposite direction, and they're both toxic to the extremes, to say God wants you to suffer and be poor because it makes you more righteous. And in fact, it created a sense of superiority complex, I think, for my dad, that I'm better than you because I suffer more than you. And then flipping it on the other side, I think, is just as toxic, to say I'm better than you because I have more money than you, and God wants me to be rich. And so I think having that healthy balance, that money is a gift from God, it's not garbage, and it's also not a God. There's 3 G's, that something is a gift from God, it's not garbage, but it's also not meant to be your God either.
Yes. And again, the Bible actually says that it's the love of money that's the root of all evil, not money itself. And if you think about in the Old Testament, you have some very wealthy individuals. You can think about Abraham and Solomon and David. You can think about the lives of some of the prophets. Matter of fact, at the same time, you have everybody from Ezekiel, Jeremiah, and Daniel living at the same time. And Daniel lived in the palace, and Ezekiel lived something that might be considered a little more middle class, and Jeremiah lived in abject poverty. And did God use each one of them? Of course he did. So it's your attitude there as well. One of the surprises is where you actually hung out with some of the African Americans as a girl that would be tied into the Mormon church, and of course surrounded by a lot of white people. You actually talk about being what they call a wigger, or you're basically dressing up like Eminem, and that was kind of an interesting part of actually connecting up with inner city black and white.
Right, exactly. So I have a chapter of my experience, and this experience actually forever solidified my support for school choice.
Right.
So 2 of my 17 public schools were in Kansas City Public School District, which has the dishonor of being the first public school district in America to lose its accreditation. It's that bad. And the level of violence and chaos and just a toxic learning environment, walking in that first day. So I attended the schools when I was in 6th grade, and then a different school in the same district in 8th grade. But when you go in, you have to go through metal detectors every morning, and sometimes you have to wait in the cold for long periods. And then once you get inside, you're not allowed to go to the classroom. You have to go to a holding pen, which is the gymnasium, and wait until the entire school is done, and then you are dismissed. But the whole experience, it feels like you're going to juvenile detention, and it creates, I think, for a lot of kids, this sense that, that's what you're bound for, that you're going to be forever treated like a criminal because you, at your core, you are a criminal. And we had drugs and bomb scares, and you couldn't wear red shirts with red pants, or a blue shirt with blue pants, because those were gang colors. And I faced some bullying for being white, and some of my black friends were bullied for being friends with a white girl. I think aside from the racial dynamics, the worst part is, like I said, the curriculum was so bad that I remember in 6th grade doing things that it seemed to me like I had done it in maybe 1st or 2nd or 3rd grade. And the idea that children should be trapped in these schools, especially children who are from maybe a vulnerable family or, predominantly Black or Latino, the poverty rates are higher. You're going to keep them trapped in these toxic environments where it seems like it's a juvenile detention facility. That's why we have the cycle perpetuating of hopelessness and violence, is because in many cases these families are trapped. And so it's just, to me, it shouldn't even be a political question. It's what's right and wrong.
Well, again, I think you've articulated some of that in some of the messages you've had. Of course, I remember you speaking out on all sorts of other political issues, and that is the case. But just before I take a break, let's talk about your escape, because you knew that your desire to leave for college would not set well with your father, Ralph. But nevertheless, that was an opportunity. And then, of course, you had to figure out how to pay for it. Can you maybe give us a brief overview, and then we'll talk about some of that after the break?
Sure. So one of the main catalysts for me leaving was that one of my schizophrenic brothers tried to rape me,
right,
and he groped me and he attacked me. And thankfully I was able to fend him off. But I was 17. And at that point I said, wow, I am not safe. And when it's your own family and your own home, it kind of crystallizes when something like that happens, where it's like, wow, I'm actually not safe in my own home. Mm-hmm. And so that became kind of the catalyst for an exploration of grappling with the question, is my father a prophet? And that was the first kind of investigative journalism project that I undertook.
Well, we're going to take a break, and when we come back, we'll not only talk about, if you will, the escape to first college, but then eventually the Mormon Exodus, which is another significant story there as well. And then we'll continue on through some of the other material that's in this book, and eventually you're going to hear an incredible testimony as well about how, in some respects, she came to Christianity, or come back to an idea of Protestant Christianity, due to everything from Donald Trump to science. We'll explain what that means in just a minute. It's all part of this book, Motor Home Prophecies, A Journey of Healing and Forgiveness. If you would like to know more about it, I suspect you'll be able to find it in your local bookstore. It just came out 2 days ago, but you should be able to find it. And again, we also have a link to it on our website at pointofview.net. And you also might click on the picture there, because that will take you to carriesheffield.com, and you'll find out all sorts of information about her, and also some of the accolades she's received, and even some of the endorsements for the book. So it is all available at our website at pointofview.net, and an incredible story of, so far we have the problem, but we're going to get to, in the next half hour, the healing, and even a willingness to forgive those who certainly were wronging her in ways that we would all certainly give her a pass, if you will, on maybe not wanting to forgive, but did so as that as well. So we'll talk about this college experience, the Mormon Exodus, going to graduate school, and working in the media. All that coming up right after this.
I have a little nutcracker decoration that counts down the days, and it tells me that Thanksgiving and Christmas are coming fast. But so is another special day, Giving Tuesday, December 2nd. People around the world are going to take part in this annual tradition of showing generosity in the middle of a season that's often marked by busyness and consumerism. It is so easy to focus on what we need in our own life, but I encourage you, pray about what you can give this Giving Tuesday, and consider partnering with Point of View. By partnering with Point of View this Giving Tuesday, you'll be part of a mission to give truth to America in a time when it's desperately needed. Mark your calendar so you don't forget to give on Giving Tuesday, December 2nd. Or you can give anytime by visiting us online at pointofview.net or calling 1-800-347-5151, pointofview.net, and 1-800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Continue our conversation today with Carrie Sheffield. The book is entitled Motorhome Prophecies, A Journey of Healing and Forgiveness. 300 pages, also has some great pictures and an incredible story. And Carrie, just before we get on to some other aspects, I thought since we did talk about being in college, and at this time it was, of course, at a different university than you graduated from, Truman State, but it's a place where there was Greek life and fraternity guy kisses you, and all of a sudden you realized, as you said, I crossed the Rubicon, never going back to VL status, which would be VL stands for Virgin Lips Status. And a lot of this, I think, illustrates, again, coming from a time where you're just scared of men, boys, and already had an experience, as you mentioned just a minute ago, from your brother. And in some respects, that went a different direction. It was, again, just a real beginning of wanting to jettison some of the things that have been part of your past.
Yeah, and I really wrote the book as a letter to my younger self, and really with an aim to speaking to this rising generation, Gen Z, that's currently in college and high school. I'm 41 years old now, so I think of it as like I'm like their big sister or their aunt or something. And I just, throughout the book, I talk about just our modern society and how I think so much of what's happening in our culture with sexuality and the dating culture and just the hookup culture and the way technology makes people disposable, it's really unfortunate that we've allowed this to happen. It started largely culturally in American history. It started in the 1960s. And I talk in Truman State how I felt I was very sheltered coming into this state college and just really feeling overwhelmed. I felt like, I had more in common with the international students than my fellow American students. And just the hookup culture and binge drinking and just the way that people were there to party and not study, it seemed so strange to me. Especially because I really didn't have a safety net. I didn't have a fallback, so I had to really be vigilant. I worked at Taco Bell. I worked at the student newspaper. I think there are so many things that young people today who, it's interesting, like from a wealth standpoint, a lot of younger people coming out of the pandemic are actually wealthier than when they came in. So it's not a question of material needs. I think it's really a spiritual and a cultural crisis. And so the fact that you have the highest suicide rate now compared to 1941, coming out of the Great Depression. And the most recent data we have from 2022 is from 2022 on suicides. You had almost 50,000 people commit suicide. That's a whole football stadium full of people, and that's the highest number of people ever in American history. And the highest depression rates, especially among young people, was looking at Gen Z. The suicide rate for Gen Z women is almost double the suicide rate when Gen X women were the same age. So there's a big crisis. And so my book's quite detailed about the mental struggles I dealt with, but I think a lot of them are stemming from our toxic culture that's then fueling this mental health crisis.
Yes, so completely agree. Let's begin. Most people know you as, of course, a columnist. Of course, you have a journalism background and broadcasting. Let's talk about that, because at a time when, in some respects, you're leaving Mormonism, you're also embracing this idea of journalism. And I did mention in the introduction that you actually worked with legendary newspaper journalist Robert Novak, who years and years ago we used to interview when he was alive, and then had an opportunity to really pursue this idea of journalism. Give us a little bit of that background, because that's what we know you for now.
Right, and that's really how I was able to lift myself out of the abusive environment and to support myself since I didn't have family support. I haven't spent a night under my parents' roof since I was 18. And I really, when I told my dad when I was 18 I wanted to go away for college, I was the first out of 8 kids, but I'm 5th in the birth order. So I had 4 older brothers who were still at home and participating in his prophetic mission, as he calls it. And so it's a lot easier to isolate the first one. And so what he said to me, he raised his hand like he was making an oath to the sky. And he said, I prophesy in the name of Jesus, you'll be raped and murdered if you leave. And so I actually took that as fuel to myself to prove him wrong. And it ended up being for good and for bad, in the sense that I took a lot of resentment and hostility and fear of what he had, his false prophecy, to say, you know what, I'm going to prove him wrong. I'm going to work really hard. I had 5 journalism internships before I graduated, and ended up getting a full tuition scholarship to Harvard for journalism. But in the end, resentment and anger towards someone is not a healthy motivation. And it ended up just building a lot of health problems for me later on.
Well, let's talk about that, because you are yourself talking about, of course, suicidal tendencies among your siblings, if you will, but you faced some of those as well. And of course, as I think we have already meant to mention, but probably didn't talk about too much, you worked in the corporate world as well, and evaluated various kinds of investments and those kinds of things. But again, you were pursuing success, whether it is going to Harvard or whether it's going to Wall Street or whether it's doing things in the media. But as you point out, if you don't deal with this issue of anger and forgiveness, it can eat you from the inside out, can't it?
Absolutely. And so what I found was that I was doing all these things to check the right boxes and to look prestigious and feel good about myself through my financial accomplishments or my educational accomplishments, and working at Goldman Sachs, which is the most prestigious investment bank, or at least it has been historically, and thinking that I had everything figured out. But I clearly didn't, because I harbored a lot of anger and resentment toward my dad and towards just my family of origin. And it ended up eventually there's a really great book called The Body Keeps the Score that helps explain what happened to me, which is that trauma will trap itself in your body unless you resolve it. And so by the time in 2019, it all just kind of collapsed. And I woke up and I felt like I had a taser implanted in the back of my neck. It was for 2019. And I ended up being in and out of the hospital 7 times over the next several months, maybe 4 or 5 months. But it was all just, eventually they were doing all these tests, and they said, oh, there's nothing wrong here structurally. The MRIs and the CT scans and the X-rays, it really just came down to the exhaustion and the stress that was causing this feeling of the taser just pulsating in the base of my skull, like all throughout my head, and my vision was blurred. And there's a really great doctor named Dr. John Sarno that I recommend if people are dealing with these types of things where you can't figure out what's going on from an X-ray standpoint or MRIs. Dr. John Sarno his healing books, unfortunately he passed away, but he was trained as a doctor in the 50s before, I think in the 60s, they kind of divorced the holistic view of healing, kind of divorcing this idea of the mind and the body needs to work together. And instead now we just pump you full of drugs instead of integrating what's happening with your psychology and how that trauma will manifest itself unless you forgive.
Well, we need to take a break. When we come back, we'll talk about, of course, your conversion. But one of the people you quote is somebody we've had on the program many times, Arthur Brooks, and he wrote a piece about how to stop dating people who are wrong for you. Because another part of that is that as you were also dealing with these emotional issues, you also had kind of a toxic dating pattern that you talk about as well. But let's come back after the break and talk about how after kind of rejecting Mormonism and rejecting kind of the materialism you were in, how you came to faith, because that is a wonderful story at the end of the book. And if you've just joined us, we're talking about, again, Motorhome Prophecies, a journey of healing and forgiveness. Carrie Sheffield with us. We have information about the book on our website, pointofview.net. We have a link to hers as well. And just an incredible story of growing up with a street musician father who thought he was a modern-day prophet, thought he was going to be the president of the United States, and not only just the poverty, but just all sorts of very toxic situations and some of the toxic theological ideas being presented and the rest. But then just an incredible story, not only of healing, but of course, as we've already implied, forgiveness. But we'll come back and talk about that in a little more detail. If you find yourself wanting to know more about Carrie Sheffield, maybe you'd like to contact her and have her come and speak about this book, or if you would like to get a copy of the book, we have information at our website at pointofview.net. We'll be right back.
This is the second story I have been pleased to tell in recent weeks in which a school district backed down from violating the First Amendment religious freedom of students and parents. In this case, First Liberty Institute had to sue California's Encinitas Union School District in federal court. Perhaps school officials in this beach community didn't understand or simply chose to ignore the United States Supreme Court's June 2024 ruling in Mahmoud v. Taylor. First Liberty's CEO, Kelly Shackelford, explains that according to that decision, parents cannot be denied the right to receive notice and opt out from any teaching that substantially interferes with their religious beliefs. The ruling gives clear guidance for what happened in Encinitas. Kayla Toney, counsel for First Liberty, says, "We represent two Christian families whose fifth graders were forced to teach their kindergarten buddies about gender ideology using a book called My Shadow is Pink." The story's main character is a boy who sees his shadow as pink. According to the book, the pink shadow reveals your innermost you. So the boy wears a dress to school. His father decides this is okay and puts a dress on too. A teacher at La Costa Heights Elementary read the book aloud to fifth graders. As part of the school's mentoring program, fifth grade students were assigned to watch a video of the reading with their kindergarten buddy. Then, the fifth graders were supposed to ask their kindergartner what color shadow represents them and to draw the shadow with chalk. Parents of some fifth graders had a problem with their 10 and 11-year-olds being required to tell little kids to question their own gender identity. The parents asked to be notified of future similar teaching and given the right to opt out. A district court ruled for the parents. The next step was the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, but the district voluntarily withdrew their appeal. It looks like they saw the writing on the wall. For Point of View, I'm Penna Dexter.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes talking with Carrie Sheffield, Motorhome Prophecies, a journey of healing and forgiveness. Certainly want to talk about your conversion to Christianity, and you say that two of the most powerful forces were Donald Trump and science. And, of course, people laugh when you say that. And don't get the wrong idea. You were a never Trumper, and even in the 2016 election, you actually wrote in Senator Ben Sasse, of course, an individual we've had on this program, senator from Nebraska, now, of course, president of the University of Florida. And yet you began to go to a church by Tim Keller, who's been on the program. And the science part really goes back to another friend who's been in studio with us many times, Michael Gillen, and his wife, who was an atheist when he entered Cornell but became a Christian. So share that spiritual pilgrimage, because it is a fascinating chapter in your book.
Well, that's wonderful to hear that you've had Dr. Gillen on your program. He's fantastic. And his work is just so needed. But yeah, so on the Donald Trump front, as you mentioned, Tim Keller has a fantastic book called Counterfeit Gods. And each chapter in that book is a false god that we as humans naturally tend to worship, whether it's money, power, sex, family, you name it. And generally we worship it because it's good, that it's a gift from God. And it's natural to worship, it's a tendency quite often to worship the gift instead of the giver, especially if we're caught in complacency, or in my case, if you are in a place of hostility toward the idea of God, that you want something to fill that void. And so I tried a lot of those chapters, but they kept failing me. And I tried my career, and then unfortunately, some new management came in and they laid off a bunch of people from the old management, including myself. And I was devastated. I felt suicidal because I didn't have God. I didn't have my family. It was my sole purpose. It was my religion was my career. And then my God rejected me by laying me off.
Wow.
And fortunately, I got out of that place. I even had a suicide fantasy of how I was going to do it, but thank God I got out of there. But I also tried the God of dating and marriage and relationships, and that failed just from dating. As you mentioned earlier, I was perpetuating the pattern, as quite often abused people do. They then date abusive people. And unfortunately, a lot of times they were hiding it more than my dad would hide it. My dad's more extroverted and externally controlling. And unfortunately, these patterns were more, hidden substance abuse, whether it's drug abuse or alcohol abuse or hidden cheating, just really toxic behaviors and passive aggressive control and anger and just really toxic behavior that I accepted because it was what was normal to me. And then I realized, that's a false god too.
Mm-hmm.
Dating and marriage is a gift from God, but we shouldn't worship it. But I was allowing these negative people in my life to become false idols to me. And I allowed them to hurt me and tell me I wasn't good enough. And I needed to change myself to fit what they wanted. And they were controlling. And, eventually I got engaged and I broke off that relationship and felt suicidal again, and it's just the pattern of one false idol to the next, always trying to fill that void. And so finally, to the point on politics and Donald Trump, I thought I had found a God that would not fail me, and that was the God of politics. Well, obviously, we can laugh now. That's just hilarious. But I went to the Harvard Kennedy School, and I know you went to Yale, so I'll forgive you. But
also went to Georgetown, which was my alternative to Harvard's school as well in government. Yeah.
Yeah, so I went to the Harvard Kennedy School, which is named after JFK.
Right.
And I think in some ways I had put him as a Messiah-type figure in the same way that Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated for his people. Abraham Lincoln was a Messiah figure who was shot on Good Friday, I recently learned. that became my religion, was this idea of public service and self-sacrifice, and what JFK said, that you should not ask what your country can do for you, but ask what you can do for your country. And so that's where I was, and I was being successful in my media career in fighting for the conservative ideas that I believed in. And then Donald Trump happened, and I said, wow, I am not worshiping that guy. As you said, I'm a recovered never Trumper. I don't want to get political, but eventually I ended up voting for him later in 2020, I think in part because I had a proper order of my worldview, which is God first, then people, and then things. I was living my life in a disordered way, which was I was putting people first and then things, and I was indifferent to the idea of God. But at the time when I was worshiping politics, I could not compute. I could not worship him. I couldn't stand the things he had said about women. I couldn't stand that he had donated to Hillary Clinton and didn't have a conservative track record. And so I ended up, just like you said, writing in a protest candidate in 2016. But that process where I was basically sidelined myself from working on the campaign or volunteering or being a surrogate or anything like that, it left a void. And that was the openness where I started to attend church and to study, really take Christianity seriously. And that's when I got into studying about science and studying about metaphysics and studying about how it actually takes a lot more faith to believe. I heard it put pretty well. It takes more faith to believe in a virgin universe than a virgin birth. And that's essentially, if you're atheist and you simply believe in random chance, you're believing in a virgin universe.
And again, we're almost out of time. I just wanted to kind of land by the fact that you became a Christian and you forgave your father. And in some respects, that is really how the end of your chapters in the book. But it seems to me you might share with us what you see the future looking like. Right. Well, my hope with this book, and it just came out, as you mentioned, on Tuesday, my hope and my prayer with this book is that I'll be able to connect and reach as many young people, because there is this mental health crisis among young people right now. I think from a Judeo-Christian standpoint, there's a lot of rejection of that heritage. I was in that place very angry and rejected that heritage because I had been abused by a denomination within that heritage, and I was confusing God with religion. And so my hope is that, and I've already lined up, spoke at Palm Beach Atlantic University. That clip went viral. It's already got 1.2 million views on Twitter. I'm speaking at Yale University, Harvard University. I'm speaking at Liberty University. I'm speaking to some K through 12. I mean, the book is really high school and college, just high school and above. Some educators in the Christian school system with the Herzog Foundation, which is a nationwide network of K through 12 Christian schools. And I'd love to speak at your school, Dallas Theological Seminary, but it's just been great. I spoke to the Pepperdine University student newspaper, and I think that a lot of young people, they want something they want a story that they can relate to. Yes. Great story. Carrie Sheffield has been with us, and the book is entitled Motorhome Prophecies. I do want to mention that one more time, and also mention that we have a link to carriesheffield.com, because, as she said, this would be something that could be a real encouragement to you, and I would certainly encourage you to pass it on to young people that are struggling, trying to find meaning in their life. Credible story and journey of healing and forgiveness, and you've been listening to Point of View.
In 19th century London, two towering historical figures did battle, not with guns and bombs, but words and ideas. London was home to Karl Marx, the father of communism, and legendary Baptist preacher Charles Spurgeon. London was in many ways the center of the world, economically, militarily, and intellectually. Marx sought to destroy religion, the family, and everything the Bible supports. Spurgeon stood against him, warning of socialism's dangers. Spurgeon understood Christianity is not just religious truth, it is truth for all of life. Where do you find men with that kind of wisdom to stand against darkness today? Get the light you need on today's most pressing issues delivered to your inbox when you sign up for the Viewpoints commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Every weekday, in less than 2 minutes, you'll learn how to be a person of light to stand against darkness in our time. It's free, so visit pointofview.net/signup right now. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.